Wristbands are really nothing more than a strap of leather and a couple snaps set in it, so they can be a great way to turn scraps into more inventory. In this case, I found something in the scrap bin that's probably about an 8-ounce piece of leather. It's fairly soft for how thick it is. I'm cutting a piece off almost 2 inches wide. I say almost because this is one of the things I actually like to use the metric system for. Because I'm going to be making a 5-strand mystery braid, I want to be able to divide it into 5 pieces. So I actually use 5 centimeters, which comes out about an eighth of an inch shy of 2 inches. So you could also use just 3/8 and come up with something very similar. It's about the same size. I've got these little templates that I've made up over time. This one is about 9.5 inches long. And once we get it braided, it's going to be quite a bit shorter than that. It's going to be about a 6.5 to 7 inch wristband. I've seen things like this made out of reclaimed upholstery leather, and, old belts from thrift stores. You got to be careful with those that they're actually a solid strap and not layers of thinner stuff. But I always make them out of, well, whatever scraps I have. Now the template I had, I marked some spots on each end, and I'm going to use a ruler to scratch the lines in. You can punch holes at each end of this, and if you're doing a mystery braid on a belt or a purse strap, to make those a little bit more interesting, I would definitely suggest punching the holes at each end of the cut. But wristbands usually aren't under enough strain for that to be an issue. So it's not really as necessary on these. It'd make them a little nicer if you did, but it's not necessary. So I'm just marking the lines that I can go back and cut through with the round knife. Kind of finishing up each cut at the other end. Another thing that's not entirely necessary, but I think makes it a lot nicer in the end, is to go through an edge bevel, which I've sped this up because it takes a little while to edge bevel all of this. I'm actually doing both sides on all the straps and all the little strips that I've got cut in there. Mostly it can be considered kind of an extra step because it will wear in a little bit smooth once you've got it braided. But it does feel a lot nicer on the wrist if it's rounded out. So there's our blank piece. Gonna punch a hole at each end for where the snap's gonna go. And we're ready to put some dye on this. So despite how it looks on the camera, this is actually a light brown dye. It's a lot darker when it goes on some pieces of leather than on others. It'll dry lighter whenever it's finally done. Now this is the tricky part where you actually get to braid it. I'm basically going to be taking whatever the outside one is on the right into the center, and then the outside one on the left into the center. And as I braid it up, I'm going to be kind of untangling it at the top. it looks like it becomes a mess more and more. There's a bit more scientific way of doing this where you loop it back through a certain way and then loop the other end back through a certain way to get this done. But really, I've never had any problem with just starting a 5-strand braid, and once the pieces wind up back where they belong, it just sort of pops into place. And then you just sort of even everything up a little bit. And I did all this before I finished it while it was still wet with the dye. I'll get a little bit of dye on my fingers doing that, but rather than come back and wet it down later to be able to smooth it all in, I just do it right away. And to set it all, I'm going to beat it with a hammer. And this is actually a cobbler's hammer with a smooth face on it. And then we're going to probably set some snaps. Again, we can do that before we finish it while it's still waiting for the dye to dry. You could wait for the dye to dry, come back to it later, especially if you're going to do several of these all at once. And since this is a wide strap, I'm using a heavy snap on it. I'm using a line 24 size snap. Not necessary, but in 8-ounce leather, it's about one of the easiest that you'll be able to set in it, because other snaps don't really always have a long enough shank on them to go through something that thick. If the snap hole's a little bit small or closed up, I use a fid there to open it up some, be able to push the snap through easier. Alright, now I'm putting a little bit of gum tragacanth, gum burnisher, whichever you want to call it, on some of the edges. I'm not going to hit the edge of all the inside parts of those, but I'm kind of going around the outside of it. Then I'll go back around with the little wooden burnisher to slick the edges a little bit and smooth them up. Again, this makes it feel nicer on people's wrists if they have knife round edges. For finish, I'm just using a spray that we use on a lot of different things. It's called Leather Sheen. And that's a finished mystery braid wristband. Still needs a little bit of drying time. It'll lighten up some